Good morning. I'm Jackie Stevens from Grace Fellowship Baptist Church in Meridian, Mississippi, and I'm the adult Sunday school teacher. We have been studying from John, indications in the scripture in the book of John about his being the beloved disciple. We've also had discussions about whether or not this beloved disciple is the writer of the book of John. And my research has led me to believe that quite possibly he is, because so much of the book of John has what I would call eyewitness accounts in it. Now our lesson today deals with a small period of time while Jesus was on the cross and the fact that he looks down to see his mother and gives a solution for her care. Now, before we begin, I'd really like for us to think a little bit about our families. What was your family structure when you were a kid, and how is it different now? For instance, I had a grandmother who lived in the house with us as long as I could remember. And my other set of grandparents were only 20 minutes away. Occasionally, not super often, I would see aunts and uncles, great aunts and uncles, and although my parents really only had one sibling, I only had one first cousin. While my husband has so many cousins, he may not even know all their names. But his family group had a much bigger dynamic because his mother had several brothers and sisters, and so did his dad. So we find many times that our family structure has a lot to do with our view, our morals, the way we look at ideas and things. Also, our family can include people who really were not blood kin. So we find that often a family can be defined in many ways. For instance, those of us who attend Grace think of this as a family. So many of us have known each other and been together so many years that we think of ourselves as family. So keep some of these thoughts in mind as we move through the scripture and the lesson. Our scripture today is from John 19, 25b through 30. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour the disciple took her into his own home. After this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, "I am thirsty." A jar full of sour wine was standing there, so they put a sponge full of the wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." When he bowed his head, and gave up his spirit. In defining family, I think many times we have to think about who was around Jesus, certainly his disciples, and we do know that he stayed in contact with his family. So that day at the foot of the cross were women. Now I went back and looked through the synoptic gospels, and for the most part they are not named. Remember, the other gospels were written probably at a much later date. If we truly believe John was a first-person account, then he would have known who was there because he indicates he was there. Now, according to his account in John, this is who was at the foot of the cross. There was Mary, his mother. There was Mary's sister, who's not named in this passage, but other passages identify her as Salome, who was the wife of Zebedee, and she would have been the mother of James and John. And then there was Mary, the wife of Cleopas. of whom we really basically know nothing. And there was Mary Magdalene, who was the one that Jesus exorcised the demons from, or cast out the demons. Now, if you go back and read all of these accounts, there are a lot of Marys, and it can get quite confusing. Most of the Gospels refer to these women as, in some cases, they were considered disciples, and they had come from Galilee, some saying to serve him, Jesus, or to support him, and indicating that there were other women in his group who were there also. But these 4 women really took a great risk in being at the foot of the cross. Number 1, politically because of the Romans, and number 2, for religious reasons because of the Jewish leadership. So they were taking quite a bit of responsibility for being where they were. And also with them was the disciple John, or the one that Jesus loved. So we find here that we're told that Jesus, in all of the agony, the feeling of what his mission is for being where he is, looks down from the cross and sees Mary and says to her that she is, from now on, she will be in John's household. The thing that's really interesting about this is that Mary had her own children. We know that Jesus had other brothers, and why he did not choose one of them is probably an interesting fact. According to the scripture, at this time, they still did not believe in him. So I guess it would have been very hard for Jesus to leave Mary in their care. Now, if you look at the scripture and follow Mary's role in all of the scripture, you see that she is there in many events that take place. So her being at the cross is very natural, although the other scriptures do not necessarily put her in that position. Now we find that John is chosen for some interesting reasons. Number 1, John was a cousin of Jesus. Now, I don't know about you, but I had a lot of access to my cousin, even though I only had one, and we still stay in touch. So it's quite possible that other than his being a disciple, Jesus knew this beloved disciple very well because they were cousins. Now, John was there because he really saw himself as the beloved disciple. He had spent a lot of time and energy following Jesus, and he had made a commitment, so he was there. I think many times when those of us who have younger children, we're very concerned with, if something should happen to us, what would we do? Well, most people, if they're making a will, or even if they don't, try to pick out someone whom they can trust, that they would be willing to entrust their children to, but also someone who would be willing to take on that responsibility if it was necessary. So we find that the divine and the human side of Jesus collide in that he looks down in all of this physical agony he was in, as well as the agony of giving up his spirit, and he sees Mary, and he realizes he has a responsibility there, which he takes into account. Now, John, on the other hand, is probably feeling that this is the last time he will see Jesus, as well as the other people who are in the group there that are gathered around the cross. Now, Jesus has some interesting comments to make about family. And I know I've read these scriptures before and felt really uneasy because I love my family. I love the people that were around me when I grew up. So what Jesus has to say about family in other scriptures is sometimes a little bit difficult for us to understand. But it boils down to one fact, and that is that Jesus is more important than family. So here's some examples, one from Matthew. Do not think that I have come to bring peace on earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. For one's foes will be members of one's own household. So anyone who loves family more than him is not worthy. In Mark, he has this to say, Who are my mother and brothers? And looking at those who sat around him, he said, Here are my mother and brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. Now this scripture was rendered when Jesus was preaching, and one of his disciples came to him and said, Your mother and brothers are here. And this was Jesus' response. And our first reaction is that this was rude and dismissive and is very unsettling. But the idea is that Jesus came first. And then in another scripture in Luke, he gives this example, and I call this the excuses passage. He talks about the fact that there are various people who want to follow him, but they have excuses, such as burying a father. Another one had to plow a field. Another one had to go and take care of a relative, or farewell to family members. But in all, these scriptures point to the fact that Jesus comes first. We're to love Jesus more than we are to love our families. And then the second idea from this is that a family might not be your best source of support. I know that we have friends and acquaintances who have basically lost all of what we would call their blood family. And so they make families in other ways. My husband was active duty Navy, and we were stationed on Guam, and there was no way we could come home for Christmas. So we made Christmas with our other Navy friends. One year we were so fortunate, Dave's parents flew out, and they were everybody's parents because none of us had parents except us. So we find sometimes that I don't want to use the term necessarily make do with other family, but we have friends and close relationships that are just important as some of our blood relationships. And these people have mentored us, or they've been there when we needed somebody. Often in today's world, we are far away from family. So it's more difficult to depend on them for support. As I mentioned earlier, at Grace, we think of each other as family, and we depend on each other, and we help each other in times of grief or joy, whatever it might be. We would like to think that we are present. So for Jesus, these family relationships came below things of God. Now, the last part of this scripture focuses on something that is an interesting comment, particularly how it's handled in the other Gospels. After Jesus tells John that this is to be his mother, and John says, basically he accepts the responsibility, Jesus says it is finished. Now, in looking at this, I went to Barclay because William Barclay is one of my favorite commentaries, and I depend on it for some background. He says that John, in recording this, it is finished, has really shared with us some extremely deep meanings in the mission of Jesus. Number one, he is using a word that indicates that it is like one who would lay his head back on a pillow at the end of the day, in which he could look back over the course of the day and see that it had been good. Things had been accomplished He was pleased with what happened. And the same word was used to describe it is finished. Others who were there at the cross might have thought that he was tired, that he was through, but it wasn't one of those wimpy, tired, it is finished. The other scriptures say he died with basically a shout on his lips. He also mentions that he is thirsty before he says it is finished. And John shares that it was raised to him, the sour wine or the vinegar, was raised to him with a hyssop branch. Now, according to William Barclay, hyssop is more like a grass and would not have supported a piece of sponge that would be soaked with a liquid. But the hyssop refers to the Passover lamb. The Jewish families at the time of the Passover in Egypt dipped the hyssop into the blood of the lamb. And he says that this is a very symbolic point that's listed here when Jesus says that he is thirsty. So we see here thirsty and finished. It is finished. Then Jesus dies. And John is sure that this is the last time he's going to see Jesus. And so are the women. But we know that the rest of the story indicates that that is not true. What we have then is that Jesus is going to overcome death, and he will be raised from the grave in 3 days. I want us to think about some things as we close. How has your family of origin influenced your relationship with God? In other words, were there relationships that extended your relationship with God, provided opportunities for you to learn and to grow, took you to church? When is it difficult for you to stay close to Jesus? Many times there are things in our lives that happen and we want to blame somebody when it's really not prudent that we do that. Another thing is, whom is God calling me to welcome? Am I that other relationship other than blood where I encourage somebody, I am a mentor for them, or I am a helper for them? I hope you'll consider some of these as you move through the coming week, and also looking forward to our lesson next week as we finalize these lessons on the beloved disciple. Thank you for joining me today.